Hello, role-playing people, and in this episode we're taking a quick detour from our regularly scheduled program to talk about downtime. Downtime is a storytelling technique which allows the group to fast-forward through certain character activities without playing them out in a scene-by-scene manner, resorting to a montage/recap type of narration instead. Though it might feel like this is very metagame or board gamey, lacking the immersion and depth of scene-by-scene narration, downtime can actually do a lot for your chronicle and enhance your story. It solves pacing issues that threaten to turn the game into a completely different genre, drowning it in too much action. It gives protagonists of different backgrounds with different interests the space to tend to their own matters before returning to coterie business. It allows the chronicle to stretch over vast lengths of time, centuries maybe, like the Transylvania Chronicles, and it neatly justifies XP expenditure and character growth. I can actually think of a few other things it does, but for now these are essential for Vampire the Masquerade, so let's explain them. Before doing that, however, I just want to say there are character actions that don't cater well to scene by scene or turn by turn portrayal, especially when it comes to repeated activities or extended activities. In combat, for instance, time always slows down and flows in a turn-by-turn manner. In most cases, a visit to Elysium will be counted as one scene, and no one is going to bother declaring actions every single turn, right? The interaction is less organized, it's at the player's discretion, with less emphasis on rules and more emphasis on roleplay. However, if one player wants their character to take up gunsmithing and weapon modding, while another is initiated into toxicology, while another is meditating upon the nature of the beast, while yet another writes a very passionate anti-Camarilla essay which aims to incite a new anarch uprising in this city, you need a narrative approach that allows you to portray all of these extended actions in a more dynamic fashion. So time needs to flow faster to prevent everyone at the table from dying of boredom. I mean, what, are you going to throw that one player a notebook and tell them, okay Sam, write the essay your character writes, in real time, quickly now, the session ends in 1 hour? No, of course not. And let me tell you something else. If you've never made use of downtime intentionally, calling it as such, you've probably still made use of it. Like when the protagonists don't feel like driving and take a cab to Elysium. Most storytellers will fly through that scene, describing it in brief, in montage style. The phone conversation with the operator, the few minutes wait, the arrival and boarding of the vehicle, and the drive to Elysium. These kinds of moments are only connectors. They carry the protagonists to the scene where the action and interaction happens, but are otherwise not very important in of themselves, because nothing really happens in them. If the players decide to make them meaningful by engaging in interesting conversation or doing something cool, then of course the storyteller can slow down time and allow that scene to play out. Otherwise, skip, get to the good stuff. Nobody wants to roleplay waiting in a car. In light of that, we've all made use of downtime one way or another, whether we're aware of it or not. However, things change when we implement it intentionally. So let's return to our list of things downtime helps with. The first one is pacing, where pacing represents the frequency and duration of story-intensive moments. In action-adventure games, where the protagonists are heroes, you want to keep the pacing alert as the characters travel quite a bit. Conflicts and communal goals or quests are abundant, so everyone is invested in the same things and works together. Various puzzles might entertain the players. Combat is also frequent, as the party gets attacked by beasts and thieves and monsters and what have you. And all of these things tend to happen in rapid succession, day after day, as the action beautifully cascades into more action. In this situation, downtime isn't a requirement to preserve the pacing because it's perfectly fine for interesting things to happen all the time. You cannot apply the same pacing and storytelling to Vampire, though, because it's going to break the portrayal of the setting, especially in a Camarilla game. It's a nocturnal gothic punk world in which centuries-old manipulators pull the strings of humanity with discretion and subtlety while also leading their own communities of the undead and enforcing the traditions. Elders are never going to risk their hides for glory, riches, or renown like some epic heroes or adventurers. Most of the time, they will work through others, their pawns, and just like in a huge unseen game of chess, they will make moves after prolonged and careful consideration. Because the Camarilla is such a stable structure, and because the game also encourages themes of personal and societal horror, loneliness, alienation, depredation, deception, and politics, time in Vampire the Masquerade flows differently, and the pacing needs to follow along if it is to support those themes and moods. It is as if the action happens in a time and place that is almost parallel to the world of the living. That being said, if too much open conflict is happening in a Camarilla game and too frequently, it undermines this feeling of stasis, authority, stability, and discretion. If every week some other entity is attacking the city's kindred with no regard for the Masquerade, be it werewolves, Quajin, Bali, various infernalists, the Sabbat, and so on, yeah, the setting is going to collapse. It's going to stop making sense. It's not going to feel right. So the solution here is to use downtime. Obviously, things need to happen, otherwise the game is insufferably boring, but they shouldn't happen all the time. For instance, in Chicago by Night, during Prince Lodin's rule, there was a period of 50 years in which nothing significant in terms of conflict happened. This time is known as the Koshmar Praxis, a time in which, like I said, no major events happened, no big moves were made in the political world of the undead, and Kindred were free to just tend to their backgrounds or expand their backgrounds and attend Elysium, I guess. And this mention brings us to our second point. The protagonists of Vampire also need time for themselves, away from the dynamic communal affairs the coterie tends to as a group. The individual Kindred needs time to instruct retainers and tend to havens, time to hunt, time to study and develop skills, time to expand their network and enhance their security, to think about things like morality and the beast, or maybe how to fireproof a private haven. Hatching up sneaky Machiavellian plans and making choices that might affect your eternity is also a big deal and shouldn't be rushed. Also, when it comes to extended activities that benefit and involve the entire community, such as building defenses against a potential Sabbat attack, preventing anarch uprisings, finalizing a safety protocol, and so on, all of these take time. And there's a reason why the Prince and Primogen meet fairly frequently in Elysium to discuss city matters. Everything in the vampire world takes time, precisely because there's so much of it. You would be a fool not to use it fully, to make the best of it. So, with important story events not really occurring every week, requiring the coterie's participation, the protagonists can pursue individual goals and develop in whatever way the player sees fit. This is one of those things I think really sets World of Darkness games apart from other RPGs, because in most other RPGs, it is the storyteller who controls the action and the pacing to a much higher degree. They can just make stuff happen and throw things at their players so much more frequently than you can do in Vampire, because the setting itself allows for that kind of dynamic action. But in World of Darkness games, the players control the action and pacing to a much higher degree, because the game encourages a more open, sandbox style of play, precisely because of the inclusion of backgrounds, external resources that the protagonist can make use of. Moving on to the third point, I actually want to take this opportunity to advise new storytellers to please start your Chronicles a bit further back in time if you're going to do a longer game. If you start your Vampire Chronicle in 2022 and after only a month of in-game time, you've had a werewolf attack, a Sabbat siege, a Setite corruptor destroying the society from within, an anarch uprising, and an elder waking up hungry and in frenzy, the pacing is clearly off. And I might sound condescending, but I'm saying this in total kindness and compassion because I used to do the same thing. I used to make the same mistake. And then my Chronicle turned into Vampire D&D and players threw caution into the wind and I didn't know why. This is why. If you're going for a short game, just one story for your players to enjoy, that's great. You can set it wherever you want because it doesn't need so much time to develop in all of its narrative complexity. If you want the Chronicle to go long, give the stories time to develop. Give the player characters time in between the stories to address their emotional issues, to learn, to grow, to spend that XP. Reduce the frequency of major events to the point where they don't blow up the setting and the city feels like it's being threatened or even destroyed by a different monster every week. And since we're on this personal note, let me tell you, I really enjoy starting longer Chronicles in the early 80s for Modern Knights games, because then I have a good 20 plus years till Gehenna, or a good almost 45 years till 2023 to make things happen and also illustrate periods in which nothing happens. The nocturnal loneliness, the repetitiveness of the hunt, every night being the same, a copy of a copy of a copy, and business carries on as usual. But really, if you think about it, there's nothing keeping storytellers from starting a game in the 12th century or even earlier in antiquity and bringing it all the way into the modern nights, downtiming entire centuries away. Time in an RPG is your narrative device. The story can go as long as you want it to, as long as it needs to. And what's amazing is you can cover a whole millennium within, 20 real-life sessions just by using downtime appropriately. Before moving on to the fourth and final point on my list, which is XP expenditure, I thought I'd present how I do downtime, and I'll integrate it into a quick example. Let's say the protagonists have been tasked with staking a tradition breaker and bringing them to justice. Not only did this vampire embrace without permission, but they embraced a child less than 10 years old, which is horrible. The sheriff is already tending to another more important matter, so he pulls some strings and gets these neonates on board for the hunt. For a few sessions that play out scene by scene, the characters ask around, use their backgrounds, disciplines, or other means at their disposal, and they manage to locate this kindred and their illegal progeny. Arriving at the scene, as expected, combat ensues, and here the flow of time changes, right? We go turn by turn because combat demands it. The protagonists successfully stake the lawbreaker and their progeny, so we do another scene in which they deliver the torpid bodies to the sheriff and maybe receive a little symbolic reward for their assistance. This story is not over yet, and usually I like to downtime at the very end of a story, but in this case the investigation is out of the character's hands for now. The sheriff or some trusted Tremere assistant is going to investigate further using rituals such as Bloodwalk or the discipline Dominate to find out exactly why a loyal and upstanding member of the community went haywire and embraced a child without any permission, without any logic. Because this part of the investigation is going to take about 2 weeks, I announced to my players the intention to downtime it until new information comes to light and the story can continue. Certainly, if they want to keep going scene by scene, leading the story and pursuing personal character motivations, all good, we can do that. But I am signaling to them that this story will continue in 2 weeks. If they get bored of the small-time night-to-night activities at any point, they should downtime. And it's actually very good for them to do that because they can now spend the XP they've been saving up. You see, most skills and knowledges take prolonged study or practice to perfect, and this brings us to the fourth point on my list. To simply let a player get, I don't know, occult from 2 to 3 from one night to the other without the character having done anything to boost that stat. It makes no sense. It's not supported by narration in any way. We don't develop knowledges and skills at the drop of a hat by simply spending XP, right? So in this 2-week downtime, besides routine feeding and all of that, the player might declare that their protagonist picks up all the books they can on ritual, folklore, and strange encounters, taking notes, comparing sources, and really delving into that study, reading the nights away. Maybe another player will spend this time to craft a few things in his mentor's workshop, thus including the mentor background, or another will hit club after club, night after night, sharpening their manipulation or seduction skills. So now we have a narrative justification for why the players spent that XP and why the characters developed and got better at doing things. If roles need to be made for certain activities during this 2-week period, hunting roles or crafting roles or background roles such as receiving tutelage from a mentor, we roll away, record the successes, and at the end of the downtime, each player presents a little montage of what their protagonist did based on those results. Keep in mind, players are not limited to simply spending XP, but their characters might use backgrounds, soliciting valuable information from contacts, placing allies in positions that will benefit them later, training new retainers, and so on. All of these things will contribute to the story and change the status quo, even though they happen in montage fashion. And for really important interactions, we can even halt the downtime, do the scene, and then continue. So, after all of that, after the players declare their downtime actions, spend XP, make their rolls, and the results of these actions are narrated in brief, the story resumes, scene by scene. To continue with the example I've already started, it turns out the lawbreaker had been dominated into embracing this child. Certainly, it will not save them from destruction because the deed is done and there is no excuse, but it turns out the anarchs were behind it, so the characters can start investigating in that direction. This is but one example. If the story calls for it, you can downtime as frequently and as long as you need. If the story is about a Malkavian's premonition regarding the awakening of a very powerful elder buried beneath the city, downtime only adds to the tension, right? The characters are busy with other matters in the meantime, but there's always this nagging little thing in the back of their minds. A question, will this premonition come true? Investigations, so far made in this direction, show there's nothing there, nothing to worry about, no freaky elder. But what if this Malkavian is right? So time passes, the omens are slowly made manifest, the tension rises, and finally, after a decade, the elder rises. And you had been warned, but you didn't manage to prevent this. It's really good to use downtime, especially for these kinds of stories, because a lot of the horror surrounding Gehenna or premonitions is based on omens that are slowly showing themselves. They're made manifest and cannot be prevented. To have all of them manifesting at the same time, well, that's not so great, but to have them manifesting at different points in time, repeating themselves slowly, ominously over an extended period, like a shadow slowly stretching over the entire setting, blocking out all hope, all light. That is awesome. So that's how and why I use downtime in World of Darkness games, not just in Vampire, but I think this game best exemplifies the need for it. And speaking of examples, earlier in the episode I mentioned the characters taking a cab. Whether you noticed or not, downtime is also implemented in Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines. For the entirety of the game, Whenever the protagonist takes the cab, the screen goes black and we skip the drive. We fast forward to where the action happens because the drive is simply a connection scene, bearing no importance. However, during the last quests, the drive is brought into the foreground and treated as a scene. Why? Because it's important. Because the protagonist decides their allegiance and endgame by speaking to the driver, who may or may not be Kane. Something that hadn't been given particular meaning throughout the entire game, but had been there all along, is now given ample meaning and importance. Really nice. And this ties in really well with a suspicion I've had. We're going to call it a suspicion, though it's not the best term. I've always considered the storyteller of Vampire the Masquerade to be less the person who comes up with monster encounters and more of a movie director who needs to check the pacing of the story, which scenes are important and need to be played out, which little things can happen off screen, when to move certain scenes that tend to be the foreground into the background, and vice versa. Very much like the famous final cab ride of Vampire Bloodlines. And it's important to occasionally tone down the detail of description. I mean, all repeated activities become boring when you describe them in detail every single time they happen. So knowing when to just skip through a scene is almost as important as knowing when to describe in vivid detail for a longer chronicle. Thank you very much for listening. Take care, have fun, and don't forget to play.